Welcome to the Unbroken Arrows podcast. I'm Greg, and I'm by myself today. Catherine has the day off. Today my guest is Tony Jones. Tony is the author of The God of Wild Places. And if the name sounds familiar, Tony was a guest of ours at the Pheasant Fest and Quail Classic this past March, and he joined us there, and we talked a little bit about the book, which was not out for distribution at that time. So the book was released, I do believe, in April, and I've had a chance to read it, and Tony has graciously agreed to be a guest on the podcast again. We met at Pheasant Fest, and since then I've read your book, so Tony, count me as one of the people that really appreciate and really enjoyed your book.
Thank you.
Well, my first question is, in the first part of the book, in your introduction, you talk about that 45% of Americans age 40 and younger claim no religious affiliation. And during that same time, Americans are finding the outdoors, who are finding the outdoors and outdoor activities. Those numbers were increasing significantly. So what are your thoughts as to why that is, Tony?
Well, to take the second question, the second part of the question first, I think that Americans' involvement in outdoor activities and pursuits has increased in large part because of the pandemic. It was just one of the few things you could do was go outside and, national parks were still open. People could still hunt and fish, even when restaurants and schools were closed. So I think, like, for instance, here in Minnesota, the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, which was always, a very popular destination, became, frankly, overrun with tourists during the pandemic and shortly thereafter. So much so that the Forest Service had to reduce the number of canoe, or overnight canoe permits available because so many people were using it, and it was really taxing the resource. And I also think that outdoor pursuits are increasing in popularity because religion is fading in America. Not just religion, but really all voluntary organizations are fading in America. You think back to, I don't know about your grandparents, but my grandfathers were both in the Chamber of Commerce. They both were in Rotary. You might have had grandparents who were in the Lions Club or Bible studies or, et cetera. All those kind of voluntary organizations have fallen on hard times. They're all suffering. I mean, even things like the Boy Scouts, numbers are just way down compared to what they were 50 years ago.
Sure.
So in some ways, it's just a cultural phenomenon, and religion is wrapped up in that. Organized religion, people are less committed to church, synagogue, temple, this kind of thing. But then there's also another aspect, and I'm actually involved in the first big nationwide survey of non-religious Americans. And there are various reasons that people have left religion, but a big one of them is, I'd say there's just a scientific framework, a scientific worldview, you might call it, that is dominant for most people nowadays. I mean, that's how people understand the great mysteries of the world. In the past, we thought thunderstorms and earthquakes were signs from the gods. That's how our ancestors understood natural phenomena. We now think of thunderstorms as a cold front moving in and hitting up against a warm front and causing turbulent weather. I know you've got some
right now
yourself right now, and you're
right.
Probably not looking out your window and wondering whether the gods are angry with you because you have a line of thunderstorms rolling through.
That's correct.
And that's just a dramatic change from the last 100,000 years of human history. Those kind of things were attributed to supernatural forces, and now that's just not how we explain those phenomena. So
right, with technology and things like that, like I can go to my phone and look at the radar and see that there indeed is a line of thunderstorms that are moving through. And you mentioned like people my grandparents' age. I'm not, my grandparents on my mother's side were both born in the late 1800s. So, they might be a little bit older than your grandparents. But at that time also, those organizations you mentioned and the churches were one of the main, if not the main, focus of socialization. And now, again, with technology, I can talk to my son who is stationed in Italy right now. I can FaceTime with him, and I can do those kinds of things. So those types of things that were, I should say, maybe back in the day, the main forms of socialization, to talk to people and to communicate and keep in touch, that has changed as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. I mean, everything about our lives and our world has changed so dramatically. And religion was one of those things that was kind of a foundation or a cornerstone of how people organize their lives. And it's one of those things that no longer does for a lot of Americans. Among younger generations, nearly 50% of them don't affiliate with any organized religion. Now, that's not to say they're not spiritual,
right? And
that it's not to say they don't believe in God or they don't pray. We've got all sorts of statistics about those people doing those activities, having those behaviors, but affiliating with an organized religion, joining a church, that's for a lot of younger people in America, that's not part of it.
Sure. In your first chapter, Vestments, you talk about your time on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation as a missionary. Yep. And you wrote that you learned there how to be a Christian, and the work was never ending, but you didn't get tired. Before that, I guess, you said that as your religion waned, your love for the wilderness waxed. So in that particular scenario there, when you learned how to be a Christian, doing that type of work at that point in time in your development, I guess, in your ministry, what part of that religion or your responsibilities in ministry waned?
Oh, yeah, interesting. Well, I mean, I would just say that on the reservation, when I was doing that work, living on Pine Ridge, I felt like Christianity made the most sense to me, more sense than it had made, when I was in college or when I was sitting in a pew in a church. And I think that's in large part because of, I don't know, the rawness of what I was doing, the people with whom I was doing it, everything, it just kind of clicked. I really loved the work. It was very gratifying. I felt like I was doing what I was supposed to do, that kind of thing. So, and I think a lot of people have had that experience, at some point when you were following your passion and everything just clicked. And, I went on to be a pastor at a big suburban megachurch. And I don't know, man. I mean, as people can probably guess, when you're on a pastor on a big church staff, you spend a lot of time in meetings, you're talking a lot about the budget. You're talking about how many people came to church on Sunday. You're talking about, whether the worship band is good enough, that kind of stuff that frankly seems pretty far removed from the message of the gospel. And, if you're a Christian, like what Jesus is all about and why he came. So on the reservation, we just did the work and we just loved people, and it just seemed a lot more organic and natural. So I'd say that was the big thing when I was out there, why I loved it so much.
And that was going to be my follow-up question as well, because I don't know if you remember from our previous conversation, but I was a science teacher, and then I went into administration, and that love of teaching is not the same as being an administrator, the love
Right,
of being
right.
with people and working with students, but it's totally different. So I wondered if your love for the parts of your religion that waned in part could be because your responsibilities in the ministry changed.
Yeah, I mean that's probably true. It's the old proverb or the old saying about you see how the sausage gets made,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
it's not so fun. And I'm sure in the same like school setting that you were involved in, some people really thrive in the administrative roles and they love it. But other people try it out and say, I'm not meant for this. I'm supposed to be in the classroom teaching kids. So, yeah, I think that was part of it for sure. And then, as I recount in the book, I also had like a lot of personal grief and pain that kind of pushed me out of the church as well, because, I went as well as we'll probably get to. I went through some turmoil, went through a divorce and a subsequent custody fight. And let's just say the church, the church in general wasn't super welcoming to me in the midst of all that.
Sure. And that's something I'd like to point out also about your book, Tony, is you really are vulnerable. I mean, you share a lot of your personal story and some of the things that you had to work through. And I think it's sometimes tough to maybe talk about those kinds of things, whether it's in written form or, you know, verbally, like this type of a situation. But bottom
Yeah.
line, I think that's kind of a healing process. You kind of got to go through that process to maybe make sense of everything that was thrown at you.
Yeah, Greg, it took me a long time to get there. I mean, I worked on this book for over a decade, and I've got to say, like, as having read it, I had several people comment on a particular line that I put in there that came out of a custody evaluation psychologist report, and it does not paint me in the best light.
Well, can I guess that that's the investments where you talk about is it a court appointed?
Yeah, yeah. And I'll just say, like, Greg, that wasn't in earlier versions of the manuscript. It took me a long time, I think, to have the courage to put that in there, knowing that it wouldn't make me. It's not the most attractive thing anyone has ever said about me, but it was part of my journey to be honest about that and put it in there. So it did make it in there, but that was a long process to feel comfortable with that.
Right. With regard to that statement, Tony, that's in the book, it talks about that, and you mentioned several different times within the book about masks,
Yeah,
that you became an expert mask wearer.
yeah.
And not that we're mask, usually we talk about covering our faces, but were the vestments part of your ministry? Was that also considered a mask in your mind?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there's a line in the book about what they teach you, what they taught me at seminary,
Mm-hmm.
is the reason that for those of us who are in church traditions that you wear vestments like a robe, wearing a robe over your outfit, it's so that the people in the congregation don't get hung up on the color of your tie or the cut of your skirt or whatever the case may be. You cover all that up so that they only hear the word of God. They don't, worry about how expensive their pastor's suit is, But it can also serve to kind of be this metaphorical or symbolic shield, almost like a shell
Mm-hmm.
that you wear to hide the truth or hide the reality of your own life. So, I mean, that just ended up being a bigger metaphor for me in my life, is that I was going to church on Sunday and climbing up in the pulpit and preaching as though everything were okay and I had life all figured out. when the truth was that my life was a mess, that I was in a very toxic relationship. It was taking not only spiritual and mental tolls on me, but it was taking a physical toll on me, and that I, ended up in the hospital a couple times with kind of stress related ailments. And so, yeah, those vestments became a bit of a shield, hiding the truth from the congregation, and really trying to hide the truth from myself.
Your next chapter carries the title Peace. And I would just like to say that, some of the parts of that particular chapter where you found peace, I think a reader would be very interested as to how that developed. And you do a great job of describing those events with your friend Doug. One of the things that I also appreciate and I really enjoy, someone who writes, especially when we're talking nonfiction, writes in a way that sometimes, you can relate to them, we could be best friends. And then there could be another time or a passage that you write that's like, why would you do that? Or, I can relate with the other side of that or situation. And what happened to me was there's a passage that you talked about Doug's reaction to where you decided to clean some ducks. And I could see myself in Doug.
Interesting.
Yeah. And I know that if I would go back and could push rewind on some of those memories in life, I probably used those same exact words that were used by Doug in that situation. Why did you choose to do it there? And that's not where my dad would want it to be, or that's not how we did it. And that type of interaction was one that brought out some feelings of my past. And then in that same sequence, there was a situation where you were helping prepare the dinner, and specifically, I think you were dicing up some tomatoes. And he told you that's not the way to do it, or here's a better way to do it. And you reacted by saying, you're not my dad, and left, or you're not my father. And left. And then you say, to this day, that reaction troubles you. What about that reaction is what troubles you?
Well, first of all, I want to say, of all the interviews I've done about the book, you're the first one to ask about that. So it's interesting to me that you found some parallels with your own story in that. And I'll just say at the 30,000 foot level, the hope of any memoirist is that a reader finds themselves in the story, even though they're not in the story literally.
Right.
But the point, I think, of a good memoir is hopefully that the reader says, even though I didn't live this life, I have a lot of resonance with this life. And I've heard from a lot of people who say, I don't hunt. I've never hunted and I never will hunt, but I still loved your book because, et cetera, et cetera. So that's gratifying. And it's interesting you find yourself in Doug. I think it was almost cliche when I yelled at him, "You're not my father," and I ran to the other room and kind of melodramatically threw myself down on the bed. I have a very vivid memory of that, and Doug does too, and we still joke about it. I just think I wasn't as that whole part of the book. I try to tell the story that I had a lot of pain and I had a lot of turmoil, and I was not dealing with it in healthy ways. So it would come out sideways. Anytime we've got grief or anger or sadness and we don't deal with it in a forthright manner, it does come out somehow sideways. And there's a story just earlier in that chapter about how I blew up at a youth committee meeting when I was the youth pastor, and Doug was the chair of that committee and took me aside. That's what ended up. That's how I ended up on a duck hunting trip with him, because he kind of took me under his wing after this episode where I had all this rage at these adult volunteers who were part of the youth committee for really no reason except that I had rage that I wasn't dealing with in my own life. I was an angry young man, you know. So it was the same there. It was the same. I could have graciously said something. I could have joked with Doug. I could have been mature about it and said, well, how do you teach me, show me how to slice tomatoes. You're 15 years older than me. You got more life experience than me. How do you go about doing this? But instead I blew my top and acted in a very immature manner. So I just included that story because it was all part of this overall experience I had of being mentored by Doug.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have a recent experience that mimics that one too. So,
Okay.
but I won't share it at this time. But you also mentioned that peace is easier to claim than it is to achieve, and I would say, my words are, when you're at peace, you know it, but it's really hard to describe. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. And I'll say that even like writing about it in the book, writing about trying to write the passage about me sitting in the duck boat with Doug in the middle of the storm, or trying to write about the night where it's 3 a.m. and I'm in the Boundary Waters on a canoe trip and I can't sleep and I climb out to the edge of a jetty and with my face into the wind, watching the stars over the lake and hearing the loons call, trying to those are, if you're asking another great question, those are very difficult passages to write. It's a little bit easier to write about something very dramatic. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Something that happened that is extraordinary and visceral and shocking. But to write about something that's quiet and peaceful, well, some of our great writers, if you think of like some of the great outdoors writers, whether you're into somebody like Sigurd Olson or Aldo Leopold, or whether you like Wendell Berry or Annie Dillard, they're able to write about moments of quiet peace in ways that are very evocative. So yeah, those were hard passages to write. I don't know if I pulled it off, but there was much writing and rewriting and revising over the course of time with those.
Is there a connection between peace and trust?
Oh, I suppose. I think, my lack of peace, as I try to make clear in the book, was rooted in my own insecurity. So did I not trust myself enough? Did I not really trust God, even though I was preaching every Sunday about trusting God? Yeah, probably those are very much connected.
And I asked that question because you mentioned that in that situation, in this part of the story that you were telling, you had to trust Doug.
I did. I had to trust Doug. I didn't have much of a choice.
Right.
Which was probably good because I have a strong personality and I tend to try to solve problems and, that kind of thing. So if I would have had a choice, I probably would have been more proactive, but I just really didn't have much of a choice. I just had to sit back and kind of let those things happen to me.
And that reminded me of, as a child, falling asleep, say in the back seat on the way home, from visiting somebody. Your parents are in the front seat. You trust the fact that you're going to get home safe. And that's kind of the analogy that I had in my mind with regard to, you had to put your trust into Doug to get back safely. So
yeah, I was going to say, and he did get us back safely. Yep.
Right. You also mentioned that, in that particular story, Doug's actions were a proxy for God, and that God visited you in Doug. In what ways, I guess the easiest way to ask that question, in what ways did God visit you through Doug?
Boy, that's a good question. I've been honestly, I've been kind of dreading somebody asking me and saying, "Are you
Sorry.
making Doug a stand-in for God?" Or I
No,
don't know that I have
and that's
an
not how I'm asking
answer.
that. No.
No, I know
Yeah.
it. I know it. But it was one of those. This is probably my own challenge as somebody who's trained in theology.
Mm-hmm.
As a with a PhD in theology, is that it's a real danger for us to anthropomorphize God, and that is to take the idea or concept of God and talk about God like God's a human. Because, I mean, if there's one thing we know God is not, it's human. If you believe in God, which I don't even think is required for any of this conversation, but
Right.
let's say you do, I mean, probably the one thing we can agree on is that God is not human. And yet, even the Bible is full of human type analogies sitting at God's right hand, even though I don't think anybody thinks God has a literal right hand or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So, Doug is a proxy or a stand-in for God only because I was forced to put my trust in him. And Doug is actually, I mean, one of the things that's helpful about this is that Doug is a very godly guy, has a very, very strong faith. So that might be another reason why it kind of works in the analogy. But yeah, I mean, I think that we do this sometimes, right? I mean, we do believe that. I think a lot of us think that God or the supernatural speaks to us through other human beings. It's not always like in some kind of a trance state or through a dream. Sometimes you look back on a conversation you had with a friend or a loved one or a family member, and you think, wow, I really think God was speaking to me in that conversation. It's that the way that I mean it, that
Right.
Doug kind of was a proxy for God that day.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
you also mentioned that when in the wilderness, and if I say it correctly, that the wilderness was, you mentioned that the wilderness was a catalyst for peace.
Yeah.
And an interesting thing that you wrote, then you talked about the masks that you had mentioned previously, that the masks serve no purpose when you're in the wilderness because there's no one there that
Right.
is going to, that you're going to have to try to quote unquote fool, or you're on your own. You don't have anything else to prove other than to yourself.
Right. It kind of strips away. I mean, it does. It strips away the masks that we tend to wear when we're in society, when we're around other people, when we're trying to, always, I don't know, convince somebody that we're better than we actually think we are. And
Mm-hmm.
in the wilderness, it's a bit more raw of an experience. That's what I love about it, because it was to what you and I have already been talking about. I really was lost kind of in my own desire to convince the world that I was doing better than I actually was. And then in the wilderness, it strips you raw of that kind of stuff. And really, the deeper you get into the wilderness, and I'm not like a guy from Alone that they drop off, by a helicopter in the middle of the woods for 3 months.
Right.
But when I have my wilderness adventures, whether it's in the Boundary Waters or like on those duck hunting trips, like with Doug, those things will just get in your way. Those masks.
Mm-hmm.
When you're pretending to be something you're not, it's only going to hinder you and hinder your ability to survive and thrive in wild places. So it's just one of the things I love about being in the wilderness is it takes all that away.
Well, place is one of my favorite chapters because as you describe your family cabin and the different ways that you visited it reminded me a lot of our family cabin in Minnesota.
Mm-hmm.
There are very there are a few similarities and there are some differences as well. And our cabin is so small that it sounds like a lot of your family would come together all at one time. And in our case, our cabin's too small for that. So
Yeah.
maybe we would overlap one night, something like that. So the description of that is something that many people I think could relate to with regard to making travels to the cabin or a place that a resort maybe that they go to often as a family. But there was a situation or a event that involved renting a bobcat that again
Yeah.
resonated with me because, well, tell me about what happened with the bobcat, and then I'll go ahead and share my side of how that came across to me.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you mentioned that. I mean, first of all, I'd say, that chapter on place, I really wondered. I did not know if people would connect with that chapter because it's about a place that's very dear to me, and that none of my readers has ever even been to. That's what's tricky about it. It's
Right.
not like I'm writing about Yosemite National Park, and I'm like, oh, well, millions of people have been to Yosemite or something like that. This is so again, gratifying to hear that I was at least able to communicate well enough in writing to give people a sense of that place and my love for it. And yeah, I mean, our place it's bigger than yours probably, but even for us, we can't fit everybody at once. So we have this, Google document that we all have to like put in what weekends we're going and who can go and who can't. And it's like, flip coins to see who gets the better beds and stuff like that.
Right. The bobcat.
Yeah. Clearing some trails. We had done a bunch of logging on our property. We'd logged, 42, 45 acres. And then the loggers, of course, left logging trails, but they were really all covered with slash and debris. And we let them go for a couple of years until we thought, we shouldn't let the forest just reclaim all those trails. Like, let's get out there and clear them out. So, I said, well, nobody else in the family wanted to drive a bobcat, but I was like, oh yeah, I'm sure I can do it. So we rented the bobcat, and I was trying to clear one of these trails, and I just got backed up over a dump, and not really knowing what it was one of those things that if somebody had been filming it, it would end up on an Instagram reel of fail army blog, like you see those
Right.
people drive their golf carts into ponds,
Mm-hmm.
Well, I flipped it, and it was, the point of that story wasn't just my own ineptitude, but also it was just another, my dad plays a big role in the book, and he kind of gave this very disapproving little speech about how he knew this was going to happen. And but then also my dad ends up walking back down to where we were in the woods, where we could not get this bobcat flipped back over. And I remember just sweating in anxiety. Like, I didn't know how we were going to do it. There's no way a tow truck could come down there and get it righted. Well, my dad, a winch
Mm-hmm.
in the back of the garage, and we hooked it up to a tree, and we cranked on that winch, and everybody pushed, and we got that bobcat righted. So my dad is kind of both the villain and the hero in that little story.
That's what resonated with me when you wrote that. Your dad said, "I knew this would happen." My dad would never say that. My dad was a tremendous teacher. He very rarely would. It would be like, okay, we've got a problem, let's solve it, that kind of a thing.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
his father, my grandpa, I don't know how many times he said that to me. I knew this would happen,
gosh.
or and I often wondered how my dad and his father could be so different with those words. But my dad also had that same exact knack that you described your father of having, is, walk away, come back with a tool or something that, where was that? And how did you know
Yeah,
where it
right.
was at? Well, I used it 6
Yeah,
years ago.
my dad had like a mental catalog in his mind of where every single thing in the garage was, and it's funny, you guys probably have this too, because your cabin is a family cabin and communally owned. Not everything gets put back in the right place.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
And my dad, I mean, we still joke about this today, because he would, when he'd get to the cabin, one of the first things he would do is open up all the drawers in the kitchen. Oh no, spatulas go in this spot, and spoons
Yep.
go in this spot, and this is where the peeler goes, and here's where the corkscrew goes. He would put everything back, and nobody does that now. So stuff just gets kind of thrown back in those drawers, and you got to dig around for it if you need it.
Another thing that you wrote about that really made me think was in the description of maybe how chaotic and how stressful some of those trips were. Your first wife asked you to promise that you or we would never go to the family land again.
Mhm.
And when I read that, I tried to put myself in that situation if that was said to me by either my first wife that passed away from ovarian cancer, or my second wife, Stephanie, now.
Mhm.
What was your reaction to that?
That's a tough one. I mean, I remember feeling panicky. I remember feeling terrified. I mean, I think I was being terrorized. Feeling like, how can I choose between my marriage and the place that I love the most in the world? Why should I have to choose? I felt weak because I didn't have the courage to stand up to her and say, that's crazy. I was so scared of getting divorced that I said basically anything I had to say to save that marriage. I think the line in the book is something like, I agreed to divorce myself from the place in the world that I love the most in order to not divorce myself from my wife. And of course that was a false bargain. It's just so tricky to be so many times in a marriage, and maybe some of your listeners have had this experience before, but my first wife threatened me with divorce so many times, and she knew that I was a Christian pastor and a Christian author, and so she knew that threat, it was beyond just the threat of somebody in another profession getting divorced and thinking, oh my gosh, I'm only going to have partial custody of my kids. I'm going to lose a lot of money. I'm going to have to pay lawyers. I'm going to have to sell the house. All those things go along with most divorces. Then I had this added layer of, it's going to destroy your career as a pastor if you get divorced. And she knew that. And that was, I think, part of the fear, the terror for me of the threat that was always over my head about the divorce. So that was just another moment of that terror. And boy, I wish I would have stood up for myself, but I didn't. Not at that time. It took me several years.
Well, one of the reasons I think I connected with this chapter was that you describe good times and you describe bad times, and you kind of fluctuated back and forth to that. And like with the Bobcat, you talked about the tornado that came through and did that destruction. But with your permission, I would like to read a passage from this particular chapter that really, I think, put into words what you were going through, and maybe what other people go through in all of the different types of events that you shared about your life. Is that okay with you?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
As I just alluded to, you had a tornado that went through the area, and I'll begin with that where it says, but then a twister ripped through, uprooting the old growth, leaving my life in a barren moonscape. But what you described prior to that was that your life looked like an old growth pine forest that was a picturesque scene that comes as a preloaded wallpaper on a computer or a stock photo with all the imperfections airbrushed out. But then you go on and talk about what had grown back after the tornado. And again, I think metaphorically speaking, if I'm reading it correctly. But what has grown back isn't pretty, at least not in the conventional sense. Divorce, remarriage, an ex, step-parents, stepkids, foreclosure, attorneys, former pastor, fallen pastor, child support, spousal maintenance, credibility accused, parenting time, custody orders, restraining orders, cops, affidavits, hearings. These are the roots and stumps that trip me up, the thistles and shoots that grew up where the more majestic trees used to stand. I'll be honest, Tony, I don't know how many times I reread that passage. I personally have never dealt with many of the things that you talk about in the book, but I know people. I have two brothers that went through divorces. And surely not all divorces are that way, but your description of that particular, I guess, metaphor, if I'm using the word correctly there, between the land that you talk about in place and your life are totally woven together.
Yeah. Well, I thank you. That was another passage that I really labored over, trying to get it just right. And yes, the tornado became a metaphor for me in my own life. And there's actually another little bit that I wish I would have included in that somebody told me after the book came out. They said, who was talking to me about that same passage, and he said, some people call a pine forest a dead forest. Mm-hmm. Because the pines, the big, majestic, old growth pines are doing great, but it goes underneath them.
Right.
Because the whole forest floor is just acidic pine needles, Right. There's no understory. And as a result, there's no bugs, there's no critters, it's beautiful to the human, but it's not really a place of vibrant wildlife.
Right. And
what comes in after a pine forest gets destroyed by a tornado is aspen, mm-hmm. and not just aspen, but we've got all sorts of other wildflowers and all sorts of, and we got bugs and we got critters and we got grouse and turkeys and deer. All of these critters love that aspen stand that has taken over. And that's the part that we logged, because everybody in my family, we were all just, after that tornado hit, we were so dejected because my grandpa had bought the land based on the old, the beautiful old pine that had somehow not been logged off. All of northern Minnesota was basically logged off, but for whatever reason, this little spot wasn't. It was kind of tough to get to, and on the edge of a lake, and had some steep, bluffs, and that's probably why. But the tornado, of course, doesn't care about any of that. And I've grown to love the aspen forest, and it's a very different kind of look than an old growth white pine forest, but beautiful in its own way and vibrant and full of life.
Right. And that is something that is part of succession. You have to start over at some point in time. So in your chapter Companions, you talk a lot about, especially toward the end, you talk about dogs and humans and how they are interconnected. The earlier part of that particular chapter, you talk about different things with regard to like the hunter's paradox. Just briefly, what, in your words, what is the hunter's paradox?
Well, the hunter's paradox is the way this is just something I coined,
Right.
but it's that, I shoot and eat some animals, and other, my dogs, on the other hand, like they're like my best friends. I treat
Right.
them almost like they're humans. I snuggle with them. I sometimes let them up on the bed, and I wash them and I feed them and I carry their poop around in a bag. When I'm on a walk with them. Think about that. I'm shooting some animals, and other animals I'm carrying their feces. So it's just a strange thing if we make these decisions that are seemingly arbitrary about the different animals. But that's the hunter's paradox to me.
Right. And you also talk about the religious aspect of that in terms of, and you kind of allude to it here, but then you talk about it in the chapter that's titled Meat, with regard to being able to hunt and shoot an animal. But I was, in this particular chapter, I started to kind of make the connection between symbiotic relationships and basically the symbiotic relationship with a human and a dog, for the most part, I would say would be mutualistic. They both benefit from that.
Mm-hmm.
But in the science terms, we've got commensalism and we've got parasitism. But
Mm-hmm.
with regard to, this is the book is entitled "The God of Wild Places," and you talk about how you moved away from organized religion, not necessarily from, I guess I'll just use the word organized religion. But even that, if we would make that connection with the symbiotic relationships or symbiotic terms, no matter what we talk about, whether it's religion, whether it's our job, I guess, whether it's our relationships, we could probably fit those terms of mutualism and commensalism and parasitism along the same lines, because I think that for my own personal, I do enjoy the brick and mortar church. I do enjoy going and listening to scripture, and I do like to be educated, maybe is that the word,
Mm-hmm.
about what I'm hearing, but then I also on my own do some of those things with regard to research and studying.
Yeah.
But there are times where the church, sometimes you give a lot more, as you've described, than maybe you got back from the church. Sometimes you both benefit, and sometimes there's somebody gains favor, and the others are really unaffected. So those are my terms, I guess, but there's different scenarios with that. But like going back to your time on the Pine Ridge, my feeling from reading that is that that was a mutualistic time in your life where your teachings, the things that you've learned, and the events that you were experiencing there, helping people, were definitely a mutualistic type scenario. Would you agree to that, or would you paint a different type of?
Yeah. I mean, I get where you're coming from with those three categories, and it does make sense to me. And I think you're right. It did seem like something was happening on the reservation where I felt like I was helping people, but also it wasn't in a patronizing kind of way. They weren't really relying on me for anything. We were working together, and and I mean, I would just say regarding the church, I've been happy to hear a lot of church people who have read the book, and I was worried that people who still really, are invested in going to church and being part of the church would be offended or think that I was disparaging them or their way of belief and practice. but I didn't want to do that. This is my story, and my relationship to the church was unique. I was kind of a celebrity pastor and Christian author. So, when I went through the turmoil and kind of got rejected by the church people, it was very different than the church is often really, really great at taking care of people. It's not so great at taking care of pastors.
Mm-hmm.
And I was in a pretty high profile leadership role. So I had farther to fall, and that meant when I fell, it was a harder hit on the bottom, So yeah, I don't have anything against the church or particularly people that go to the church, but for me, it became a place that was no longer helpful. And I preached at a church last weekend in Oregon. I still preach at churches, but it's not a thing I'm going to go back and be a pastor in the church ever again.
Right. Well, and in no way place in this book or nowhere in the book do you say you can do one or the other.
Right,
I think
right,
that's part
yeah.
of what everybody is really seeking or searching is for their understanding and their level of comfort in terms of how all of this fits together for them. And it's
Yeah, yeah.
and I would say, to somebody that maybe didn't read your book because that's what they were concerned about, I did not take it that way at all.
Good.
So
Yeah, that was a needle I tried to thread to say, this is my story and I have my own particular experience with the church, but it's not the same for others. Yeah.
I have that in my notes in several places, Tony, where in terms of what my question is, I'm not challenging you because in no way in shape or form, because you hold a doctorate in theology and if I would try to get into any kind of a verbal confrontation with that, you'd wipe me up very quickly. But that was my point in my notes. It's like, this is your story. My story is completely different. And as a reader, you do have to recognize those kinds of things, and you have to pull from what you're reading what is going to work for you, and you have to be able to recognize that. And you also have to recognize that that may work for them, but it's probably not going to work for me. So
yeah, and this is so different for me because all my previous books, as I said, were all about how to pray, how to understand the crucifixion, how to start a church, how you should do this and how you should do that. And this book is so different because there's almost nothing prescriptive in it. It's all descriptive. It's like, I'm done telling people how to live their lives, how to pray, how to understand their faith. This is a book about my story, what I've learned, and if you can learn from parts of my story or you resonate with parts of it, great.
Mm-hmm. And that's why I share with you and our listeners the different parts of the book that did resonate with me, and I could see my experience in the chapter Predator. You talk about, and this may be one of those things that I look at maybe a little bit different. You talk about cancer as a predator to humans, and I guess my definition of a predator, I don't see, and my first wife died as a result of cancer, and my stepdaughter, whom I never met, also to the complications of leukemia.
Mm-hmm.
So in the word predator, I think of something that stalks, its prey, and base partly because of its innate reaction to survive. But you also in this chapter talk about panic, anguish, and terror, and those I can relate to as predators, because those are things that you cannot see, you can't touch, you can't feel. I mean, cancer, if things work out for the best of somebody that's diagnosed with cancer, doctors can go in and remove it. And there are treatments that can help knock it back or even kill it, remove it. But it's really hard for panic, anguish, terror. There's no surgery to help remove those types of things.
Yeah.
So the other part, and again, no real question there, just kind of my take on that. But
yeah.
The other part of that particular chapter, you talked about people that felt that the deer was giving itself to them. Of course, kind of as a old science teacher, I don't believe that, because it's easy to test that hypothesis. You're in a deer blind or in a deer stand, or you're hiding from this deer. If you go out, show yourself to that deer, it's going to run. And if it doesn't, then you have to question whether it's sick or not.
Yeah.
So,
right.
So I would test that hypothesis. And if if that deer was willing to give itself to me, in that particular manner, I don't think it would run away when confronted with me being in sight. But to hunt is to be a predator. There's no doubt about that. The difference between this particular outlook of the deer giving itself to you, I think sometimes that different cultures that hunt, they don't think that the deer is, or the animal is, giving themselves to them. But in the end result, if they harvest, if they kill what they are hunting, they give thanks for that animal whose life they just took. And that's because in those cultures and historically, if they didn't harvest that animal, they wouldn't survive. So if they didn't have food, they would die. So I don't know if I'm clearly articulating the two different sides of that.
Well, no, I really appreciate how you frame that, frankly, because I'm like you, like it sounds like you are. I'm of two minds. I mean, on the one hand, yes, like you, I am a modern person, and I'm very I am beholden to science, as we talked about, a while back. Science gives us our operating framework for the way the world and the universe works in a way that religion used to. Science just tells us how things work in reliable ways, and we trust science. And I do. I don't hesitate to say that. So when someone says to me, "Oh, the deer gave itself to me," or "the deer didn't give itself to me," I've asked those people who've said that to me on my podcast. I've said to them, "You're giving a deer, a white-tailed deer, a great deal of agency. Do you really mean to do that? That's not how I tend to understand how wildlife works. Like, they're conscious and they're making conscious choices." So there's that side of it. But the other side of it, which you allude to as well, is that I don't want to diminish the wisdom of our ancestors. And there's all sorts of evidence of our ancestors giving wildlife agency. Whether it's Native Americans talking about buffalo in that way, or, the ancient Romans read the auspices of birds flying over Rome, and whether that was an auspicious day to start a war or not. I mean, I just think there is some mystery and some, dare I say, magic in the way that animals, other non-human animals, behave and act, that led our ancestors to give them maybe more agency than we tend to give them. And maybe our ancestors had some wisdom that we should defer to, in addition to trusting our scientific mind.
And I would agree. And one of the things that I thought of as you're talking about that was that even though the different cultures approach that harvest in a different way, one of the words that I would use is a respect for the hunt, a respect for the kill. And one of the ways to respect what you have taken its life, is that after that harvest, you try to use as much of that animal in ways that you and family and the community can use. You know, one of the things that I can remember the first time that I saw right now the word escapes me, but essentially when people would hunt buffalo from the train, shoot it and just leave it, or skin to take its hide. And that did not go along at all with the Native American way of harvesting buffalo, where nearly 100% of the buffalo is used in some way, shape, or form. I think that this is a very deep particular chapter, and with a lot of different little areas that a person can really glean a lot from.
Yeah, well, again, I mean, I appreciate you saying that. I think there's, I mean, people are going to approach it many different ways, and in some ways, like I say, I do want the book itself to be a bit of a mirror, so that, you know, people can read it. And like you say, you know, you have different touch points in the book, right? Having lost a spouse, you haven't been through a divorce, but you know what it's like to suffer grief at the loss of a spouse. And you've been remarried, and you know the joy of finding new love, you know, and introducing your new spouse to your kids and to your family cabin, and, you know, things like that. So I think everybody hopefully finds different places in the text with which they can, you know, they can resonate and find some truth and some meaning for themselves.
The next 3 chapters are entitled Failures, Risk, and Meat. And all 3 of those particular chapters they have, again, talking points for me with regard to failures. You make a statement that that my religion didn't adequately prepare me for failure. And one of my thoughts that crossed my mind at that point was, you know, is it religion's responsibility to prepare a person for failure? So I guess I'd ask that question. Is that a fair question or a fair expectation to have of a religion?
Well, that's a good question, Greg. I mean, I do think that, I mean, religion, you know, organized religion tends to make the claim that it has basically something to say about every aspect of your life. It has something to say about, you know, there's that funny line in the book where I'm quoting a pretty famous theologian, and he says, the marks of a true religion are, they tell you what you can put in your mouth and what you can do with your genitals. So in other words, religions, dietary laws, and tend to have ideas about sex. I mean, there's little that's more basic in human life than food and sex, right? How we sustain ourselves and live, and how we procreate and make more human beings. So religions tend to claim that they have something to say about just about everything in our lives. And, you know, my challenge in the book to organize religion is just back to what you were saying earlier, about, you know, just a couple of moments ago, about like using the whole animal. It's surprising to me, looking back on our ancestors, almost all of whom claimed to be Christian, and yet would, you know, shoot thousands of buffalo just to chop out their tongues and leave the rest of the carcass to rot in the hot prairie sun. I mean, I frankly, I have a hard time even wrapping my mind around why people would do that.
Right. And
still to this day, as you know, I mean, there are still all sorts of examples of people poaching or people leaving wanton waste and not using the whole animal. We've had to pass laws
Right.
saying you can't waste part of the animal. We shouldn't even have to pass these laws. This is the most obvious thing there is about hunting, is you should use the whole animal. Or the chapter on predator. I never really heard any sermon on how we are a predator in a predator-prey relationship with the animals we eat. I never heard a sermon about the meat we eat and how it's butchered and things like that. Even though, this was like, it's funny, if you're a Christian, there's a lot in the New Testament about butchering and eating meat. This was a big controversy in the early church, was whether it was allowed to eat meat that had been sacrificed to Roman gods. Because for Jews, that was completely forbidden. And then Christians come along and, Paul, the Apostle Paul, is writing saying, yeah, you can eat that meat. I mean, don't do it if it causes your brother to stumble, but if it doesn't, you're free to eat that meat. Peter has a dream, when he's on a rooftop, he sees a vision with a sheet of meat of a lot of animals that had been prohibited from being eaten by Jews. And he hears a voice say, take this meat is what you have heard is unclean is clean. Take this meat and eat it. So even the early church talked a lot about meat and how the kind of things you put in your body. That was very important in the early church. And we never talk about that. I don't hear sermons about butchering and eating meat.
Mm-hmm.
So in some ways, I feel like my journey has been trying to get back to the things that a lot of my ancestors considered most important and that we've maybe lost sight of.
There's another part of this particular chapter that you talk about carrying your failures around with you. And does failure provide an opportunity for growth?
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, yes. I think any great religious leader, any great philosopher, any life coach, anybody who thinks about these things would say yes, absolutely.
You also mention in a Colorado elk hunt in that particular chapter, you talk about which you did not harvest an elk. You said that the failure was the success. Was that a new revelation for you?
I mean, it was hard. Here's what was hard for me, and I think that the change for me was I remember driving. I think I drove to Colorado. I drove to Southwest Colorado, which, from the Twin Cities in Minnesota is like,
it's a good trip.
I don't know, a 26-hour drive or something. Mm-hmm. I did it in 2 days, but I think I brought 3 empty coolers with me.
You were prepared. You were going.
And guess what? They were empty on the way home. And I was just, because I a lot of people knew I was doing this. This was my first ever elk hunt. I'd written about it, on social media, and I think just a lot of people knew it was going to happen. And so I was like, well, now I'm going to have to answer a lot of questions. But was it a success? That's what people are going to ask me.
Right.
Were you successful? And I wanted to be able to talk about that hunt as a success, even though I did not shoot an elk, because it was a success, because I learned a great deal,
Mm-hmm.
I learned a great deal. Even, I preached, like I told you, I preached last Sunday in Oregon at a church. I think I preached about a B+. I think my sermon was a B+. And that, I wouldn't say it was a failure, but it could have been better.
Uh-huh.
And the next time I preach that sermon on that topic, it will be better. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'm going to get better at it. That's my commitment. So yeah, I failure or lack of success, but can we still talk about something where we don't maybe achieve the goals we wanted to achieve, and yet it was still quote unquote a success because we learned, we grew, we got better.
In the chapter Risk, I'll be honest, when I got to that particular chapter, it was one of those that, I was reading in the evening, and I finished up the chapter of failure and put the bookmark in and went to bed. And I was reflecting, I wonder what type of risk and how risk is going to be described in this chapter. And then I opened the chapter, and in the first page or two, you make the comment that we now, as people at this day and age, have lost our ability to judge danger, or maybe we misjudge it, I think is what you say. That really made me think. To recognize danger, is it different in the animal world? In other words, for a human, do you have to learn what danger is all about differently than, say, a deer or a duck or any other animal that's in the wild? Because for me,
well, go ahead.
no, I was going to say, for me, the being in the outdoors, there are a lot of different dangers that you just really can't. You can prepare for, but you're not going to be able to prevent them all. Stepping in a hole, for me, that's a huge deal because I've got one particularly bad ankle. If I step on an uneven piece of ground, my hunting is probably done for that day. You read and hear on the news that somebody riding their bike in their neighborhood and a limb falls and kills them. I mean, those are things that are dangers of being in the outdoors. But that made me think, like I said, we've lost our ability to judge danger. And in certain ways, I think, well, does that also equate to maybe a decrease of common sense? Or is that something that's just the way, things are much safer now? If we go back thousands of years, kind of tying the Predator chapter back to it, when we didn't have the tools like even a bow and arrow or a gun of some type. Being a predator to a tiger was much different than, say, now, if you're a bear, for example. You've got a gun or you've got some type of weapon that can help protect you, but back then, not so much.
I mean, we've obviously mitigated most of the risk out of our lives. That's why there's 8 billion people. I mean, if you look at
exactly.
if you look at the expansion of the human population, it obviously the human population has grown for millennia, but it has spiked recently, and it spiked because we have mitigated so much danger from our lives. I mean, how many of our ancestors died because they ate tainted food? How many of our female ancestors died in labor and delivery? I mean, millions upon millions upon millions died. And so many of those, just those two dangers in and of themselves, not to mention getting, eaten by a lion or a tiger, those are just not dangers that we face anymore with regularity. So, yeah, and as I make the case in that chapter that we've lost something, because, I mean, science even tells us certain areas of our brains light up when we undergo risk. And it's a big aspect of how we learn things, and I make the point in that chapter of how I knew intuitively when I was a youth pastor that I needed to take kids to do stuff like whitewater rafting, and climbing mountains and doing adventurous things, because adolescents need those aspects of their brains to fire up. That's how they learn things. That's how they become open to new possibilities. That's how they understand themselves, by surviving risk and danger. So yeah, we definitely lose something. I mean, I'm not saying I don't want to wear a seatbelt when I drive. I'm just saying that the wilderness affords us some level of risk and adventure that is fundamentally good for us.
At the end of the chapter, you wrap that chapter up by talking about black elk. How did you do that, or why did you do that?
For one thing, I even though I'm trained as a Christian theologian, I find a great deal to learn in other traditions. And like we already talked about, since I lived on the Pine Ridge Reservation, I've always had an affinity for the Lakota people and for their spirituality and their wisdom. So, I've always found Black Elk to be a very inspirational figure. And obviously his book, the book that was written about him based on conversations with him, called Black Elk Speaks, is one of the great classics in the spiritual tradition, and definitely one of the great classics of Native wisdom and spirituality. So yeah, I just wanted to rely on figures outside of Christianity who had something to teach us, and I really consider Black Elk one of the greats.
Yeah, one of my top 5 books, and I would say that's my list, and I would say that's a must read for everyone, to be honest. Black Elk
I'm glad we
Speaks.
share that common. Yeah.
In the chapter Meat, you really go to great length talking about the biblical history of meat and coming to terms of eating meat. In the chapter, you talk about the term numinous. And so what is numinous, and how does it relate to this chapter?
Well, the numinous is a phrase that was coined by a theologian named Rudolf Otto in the early 20th century, because he felt like the term the sacred had been kind of watered down, or the holy, these common words to kind of explain our experience of God had been watered down, or like the word holy and holiness, he thought had become too much tied to human behavior. Like, are you a holy person? Are you living a holy life? This kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And he felt like we needed a different word, a new word for understanding our experience of the awesomeness of God. And so he took, he said, well, we take from the Latin word for evil, we get the word ominous. Well, let's take the Latin word for God, one of the Latin words for God, numen, and he coined this new word, numinous. And I like that word. I like it because it doesn't have the baggage of a lot of the other words. Even the word God, it's so funny because, I just did a wedding last weekend, and I asked the bride and groom, they wanted kind of a wedding that was sacred without being overtly Christian. And I said, well, how do you feel about the word God? Well, they kind of felt uncomfortable with the word God, had some baggage. But when you ask people, well, what do you think about the word transcendence or numinous? And they're like, well, yeah, I'm cool with that word. Most people don't know what the word numinous means, but they know the word transcendence. So, that's just me as an author trying to find different ways to say things that kind of will cause a reader to think about something in a fresh way.
Like me, to look it up and try to define it myself,
hopefully.
Right?
Hopefully like you, yeah.
Exactly. Now, you end the chapter, and there's no question here, Tony, you end the chapter talking about a trip back home after a hunt, and it painted an image to me, the time of year and everything about that. It painted an image for me that almost maybe Norman Rockwell.
Yeah.
How should I say that?
Rockwell,
yeah,
that.
Norman Rockwellian type of thing. So it's just cool. No question. Yeah. It's just cool. So the chapter that's titled Death, and I'm just going to say to the listeners that if you've ever hunted, you're going to be able to relate to this chapter because you've experienced in some way, shape, or form the things that you talk about. If you've ever cared for a loved one, as I have, as my wife was in hospice with her stage 4 ovarian cancer, or another family member or friend that while they were in the hospital, as their condition declines, you're going to relate to this chapter. And you wrote a couple of different things, and one of them it says, and I'm not reading the whole passage, but start by saying we've sequestered death. And then you go on to say that hunting has changed that for me in many ways that religion never did. And can you talk to that just a little bit? How have we sequestered death?
Well, I'll give you one example. I'll give you one example from my life this summer, and that is that my 41-year-old cousin died of breast cancer that she'd had for 6 years, and left behind a awesome, amazing husband and a 8-year-old son and a 6-year-old daughter. So a lot of our summer was spent, and you've been there, with watching a loved one die.
Mm-hmm.
It's very, very difficult. And when we sat down with the family, when I sat down, because I'm as the resident, clergyman in the family, I do all the family funerals and weddings. And as I sat down with my aunt and uncle and my cousin and then my cousin, my other, the deceased cousin's husband, to plan the service. One of the questions was, well, what do we do with her ashes? Do we have them in the room with us? And I said, yes, I think we need the remnant of her body in the room with us. I think that's very important. And these days, a lot of people don't do that. They don't have a funeral or a memorial service. They have a celebration of life.
Mm-hmm.
And the body, they bury the body and they get the body out of there, and then they gather, to celebrate the life, which I don't have a problem with that necessarily. But there is something about having the casket or the urn in the room with you, the reminder that this body is of the deceased person, and that it makes it more real. It brings it front and center for us. And, I think our ancestors had very elaborate rituals that dealt with the dead bodies of their loved ones. And I think they would be completely confused to show up at a celebration of life that had no body present. Having the body present has long been an important part of how we say goodbye to someone we love. So that's just one example. I mean, I could go on and on with examples of how we have sequestered death in modern life. There's that funny scene in Monty Python and the Holy Grail where they've got a cart full of bodies, and they're shouting, "Bring out your dead."
Right.
Bring out your dead, and the reason it's funny is because, of course, it's hyperbolic, because there's just piles of dead bodies from the Black Plague that they're piling up on this cart, and some of the people aren't quite dead yet.
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny, but it's also funny because it's so odd to us with modern sensibility that we would even see one dead body, much less a pile of dead bodies. Mm-hmm. And, during the Black Plague, there were piles of dead bodies. I mean, nearly half of everyone who lived in Europe died of the plague.
Right.
So our ancestors were just very much acquainted with death. And I think we've lost something by hiding it away and not being acquainted with it ourselves.
So then how is hunting a rehearsal for your own death?
Well, I mean, there you go. I mean, if you hunt, you're implicated in the death of animals. And I have this phrase of the big brown-eyed doe. I call it the eyelash rule. Mm-hmm. We have a lot of people I know, I could never kill a deer, but they fish. They don't have a problem killing a fish.
Right.
Because they kind of put these things on the sliding scale, and the closer they are to human, the harder it is to kill. But, anybody who's ever stood over a deer while it's after you've shot it with a bullet or an arrow and you're watching that deer take its final breath, it is a harrowing experience. Mm-hmm. To be the author of the death of that animal and then to be there and watch it happen. And I think, frankly, it should be a sacred moment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, this chapter, for those of you that haven't read this book and will, this chapter is a powerful chapter.
Oh, thanks.
Well, we've come to the final chapter, which is you use the title God. And to be quite honest, I'm not even going to ask a question about this particular chapter, Tony, because I think you wrapped things up in such a way that it tied the book together in a way that I almost had to go back and reread different sections because I thought you did a tremendous job of circling back through the whole book and making sense with so many things that maybe I had a few loose threads here and there, and how you wrote this last particular chapter. My hat's off to you. It's tremendous.
Well, that's very, very, very kind. And I frankly, to be honest, I was reluctant to write that chapter because, like I said earlier, I've written a lot of books about God and telling people how to think about God and what to believe about God and how to pray to God. And I kind of feel like maybe I shouldn't be doing that anymore after everything I've been through. So I was kind of reluctant to tie it up like that, but I'm very grateful to hear that you appreciated that chapter.
I really did. And the thing about the book, in my opinion, is that anybody that would be considered or considers themselves an outdoorsman, a hunter, fisher, it doesn't matter what activity. I think in some way, shape, or form, you're going to extrapolate something from this book that you're going to relate to. Some things maybe more than others, but you've woven in your story with regard to the events of your life, and you've tied it back and explained as to why the God of wild places is where you feel at peace, and you feel the comfort, and you feel those things that you yourself, as you said, it's your story. You didn't find them in a traditional setting of a church. And I think everybody can pull something from this for their own growth in how they may find God in wild places.
Well, thanks. I mean, it's as you can imagine, as an author, to have a conversation with somebody for an hour and a half that's who has really done a deep read of the book it's honoring to me and to the work I did. So I really, really appreciate it. You obviously took my work very seriously, and I've really appreciated the conversation about it. So thank you.
Well, you're very welcome. And I know that from the book, and also talking to you personally, I know that you do some pheasant hunting in South Dakota. So
yep.
I would say when you are making your way through South Dakota, if you're anywhere near Sioux Falls, get in contact. We can have a cup of coffee sometime or someplace.
That'd be great.
So Tony, thank you for taking the time. And like I said earlier, went on a little bit longer than what I anticipated, but great conversation. I hope our listeners will be able to appreciate the knowledge that you shared, your personal story that you share, and it can help everyone grow in ways that make all of us better people. So thank you.
Yeah, well, Greg, thanks for having me on, and I look forward to next time our paths cross.
Absolutely. Thanks, Tony. We'll see you. Our immediate family has experienced cancer-related deaths as a result of leukemia, prostate, and ovarian cancer. And it would be safe to say that every one of us has had our lives impacted by cancer in some way. A healthy diet and exercise through outdoor activities has the potential to improve a person's physical and mental health. At any age, if you are active, stay active. If you are not as active as you'd like to be, it's not too late to start now as a way to improve your physical and mental health. And if you or someone you know is thinking of suicide or in need of crisis intervention, call the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline by dialing 988. To all our listeners, take some time to get outside, enjoy the outdoors, and experience its healing powers. With that, on behalf of Catherine and me, until next time.